The December wind tearing across the Thornton farm did not merely blow, it hunted. It carried the bitter metallic scent of an impending blizzard, promising a violent freezing death to anything caught without shelter. The mud of the yard had already begun to flash freeze into jagged, treacherous ridges that cut through the thin leather of worn boots. Abigail Thornton, 21 years old and 6 months pregnant, stood in the center of that freezing, churning muck. She was violently shivering, her arms wrapped protectively around the substantial, heavy swell of her belly beneath a thin, threadbare wool shawl. Her late husband, a gentle farmhand who had succumbed to the sweating sickness only 2 months prior, had left her nothing but the child she carried and a profound, agonizing grief. Josiah Thornton, her father, stood on the porch of the sturdy, well-built farmhouse. He was a tyrant wrapped in expensive broadcloth, his face a ruddy map of exploded capillaries and casual cruelty. Flanking him were his 2 eldest sons, men who had inherited their father's thick, brutish shoulders and his absolute lack of a soul. "Get your useless, weeping carcass off my property, Abigail," Josiah spat, the words carrying easily over the rising howl of the wind. Abigail stumbled forward, her knees buckling slightly as the cold began to numb her legs through her thin cotton dress. "Pa, please," she choked out, her voice a fragile, broken reed against the gale. "The sun is almost down. The snow is starting. I can't walk to the poorhouse in this. The baby is a bastard spawn and a drain on my winter larder," Josiah roared, stepping down onto the top step of the porch, a heavy iron-tipped walking stick gripped in his meaty hand. "Caleb left you penniless. You eat for 2, but you can't work the fields or slop the hogs in your condition. I ain't running a charity for lazy, swollen widows. I'd eat half rations," Abigail pleaded, hot tears spilling down her freezing cheeks, instantly turning to ice in the wind. She dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, the impact sending a dull, sickening ache through her lower back. "I'll sleep in the barn with the draft horses. Please, Pa. The storm will kill us." "Then let it," Josiah sneered, his upper lip curling in profound disgust. He gestured to his sons. "Throw her off the boundary line. If she crawls back to the porch, shoot her for trespassing." The 2 brothers stepped off the porch, their heavy boots crunching loudly through the frozen mud. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look at their sister with an ounce of pity. They approached her like a diseased stray dog that needed to be put down. If you are liking the story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. Abigail curled into a tight, desperate ball in the freezing muck, her arms wrapping entirely around her swollen belly. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the brutal, heavy hands to grab her hair, to drag her by the neck until her unborn child was crushed against the frozen earth. Caleb, she thought, the agonizing sorrow entirely eclipsing the fear of the freezing wind. "I am sorry, I couldn't protect him." The hands never reached her. The brothers stopped dead in their tracks, their boots sliding to a halt in the slush. The sound was not a shout. It was the heavy, metallic, terrifyingly distinct clack-clack of a massive Sharps buffalo rifle being cocked. The sound was so loud, so perfectly crisp in the freezing air, that it seemed to stop the wind itself. It did not come from the porch. It came from the dense, impenetrable tree line of black pines that bordered the far edge of the farmyard. A shadow separated itself from the trees. He was not just a man. He was a walking monument of violence and raw, untamed earth. He stood 6'5", wrapped entirely in the heavy, thick hides of timber wolves and buffalo. The pelts were frosted white with the mountain rime. Beneath the brim of his dark slouch hat, his face was a terrifying landscape of thick, dark beard and jagged, pale burn scars that twisted across his left cheek and jawbone. Gideon Locke, the wraith of Dead Man's Drop. He was the nightmare the valley folk whispered about over locked doors. A feral, silent assassin who lived higher than the tree line, in the jagged, impassable crags where the air was thin enough to kill a normal man. For 5 years he had been a phantom, systematically, methodically hunting the men of the Thornton family. 2 uncles and a cousin had already disappeared into the high country, never to be seen again. Gideon stepped fully out into the yard. The massive Sharps rifle was leveled directly at Josiah Thornton's chest, the heavy octagonal barrel resting easily in his scarred, leather-clad hands. Josiah's face drained of all color, the ruddy red instantly replaced by a sickly, terrified gray. The heavy iron-tipped walking stick slipped from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly against the wooden porch. The two brothers instinctively raised their hands, backing slowly, frantically away from their sister in the mud. Gideon didn't speak. He didn't issue a threat. He simply stood in the freezing slush, a demon forged of ice and vengeance, his pale, slate-grey eyes locked onto the patriarch of the family he had sworn to obliterate. He had come to the farm tonight to finish it. He had watched from the tree line, waiting for the deep dark of the blizzard to mask the gunfire, planning to slaughter Josiah and his sons in their beds. He had intended to burn the sturdy farmhouse to the ground, just as Josiah had burned his 5 years ago. But when he saw the old tyrant drag his own pregnant daughter into the freezing mud and condemn her to freeze to death, something ancient, something fundamentally unbroken within the scarred, feral giant, violently rebelled. The sheer, absolute depravity of the act disgusted him on a primal level that dwarfed his own need for immediate vengeance. Gideon slowly lowered the heavy barrel of the Sharp's rifle, pointing it not at Josiah, but at the freezing mud inches from the eldest son's boots. Boom! The roar of the black powder was deafening, echoing off the surrounding hills like a thunderclap. The massive, heavy-grain lead slug hit the frozen earth with the concussive force of a cannonball, spraying sharp shards of ice and mud entirely over the terrified brothers. They shrieked, scrambling backward in a pathetic, undignified panic, slipping and falling into the slush. Josiah threw his hands over his ears, dropping to his knees on the porch, his expensive broadcloth suit instantly soaking up the freezing water. Gideon didn't reload. He let the massive rifle hang at his side. He walked across the yard, his heavy iron-shod boots ignoring the slippery slush entirely. He stopped beside Abigail. She was shivering so violently her teeth chattered audibly, her face entirely devoid of blood, her hands still clutched desperately around her swollen belly. She looked up at the towering, scarred giant, her wide, terrified eyes reflecting the horrific reputation of the Wraith. "He has come to kill us all," Abigail thought, the panic seizing her chest so tightly she couldn't draw breath. "He will start with me because I am the weakest." Gideon looked down at her. He didn't look at her face. He looked directly at the substantial, heavy swell of her belly beneath the thin shawl. His pale eyes, usually entirely devoid of anything but cold calculation, flickered with a sudden, devastating flash of an old, agonizing grief. He reached down. His massive, calloused hands, the valley believed, were only capable of tearing flesh, did not grab her hair. He slid one thick, powerful arm completely beneath the crook of her knees, and the other behind her violently shivering back. He stood up. He didn't grunt with the effort. He lifted her from the freezing slush with a shocking, breathtaking gentleness, as if she and the child she carried weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. Abigail gasped, a sharp intake of freezing air, finding herself suddenly suspended 5 feet off the ground, pressed entirely against the massive, broad chest of the assassin. He smelled of deep wood smoke, pine resin, and a raw, untamed power. The thick wolf fur of his coat was incredibly hot, radiating a furious, life-saving warmth that immediately began to draw the bone-deep chill from her shivering frame. Gideon turned his broad back on the terrified men cowering in the mud. He didn't shoot them. The gunfire would draw the town marshals, and a running gun battle in a blizzard was a death sentence for a pregnant woman. He looked over his massive shoulder, his pale eyes finding Josiah Thornton on the porch. "The girl is mine," Gideon rumbled. His voice was a deep, gravelly vibration that seemed to originate from the granite peaks he called home. It was the first time any Thornton had heard him speak in 5 years. "The child is mine." He turned his head fully away, stepping into the rising, blinding whiteout of the blizzard. "I will return for the scalps," Gideon promised the wind, the heavy, lethal words carrying easily back to the frozen porch. He didn't have a horse. The ascent up Dead Man's Drop required a path too treacherous for any beast of burden. He carried her. As the giant carried the pregnant widow away from the only home she had ever known, stepping directly into the teeth of a lethal mountain storm, Abigail clung to the thick, coarse fur of his coat, entirely unsure if she had just been rescued by an angel or claimed by the devil himself. The devil himself did not falter in the snow. The ascent up the jagged, treacherous switchbacks of Dead Man's Drop was a punishing, vertical crawl into the absolute belly of the sky. The wind escalated from a sharp whistle into a continuous, deafening, demonic shriek, driving the blinding white sleet horizontally across the exposed rock face. It struck Abigail's exposed cheeks like handfuls of shattered glass, but she could barely feel the sting. The cold was entirely secondary to the sheer, suffocating terror of the man who held her. Gideon Locke moved through the lethal whiteout with the steady, unstoppable rhythm of a glacier. His massive chest heaved with slow, measured breaths, acting as an impenetrable windbreak against the gale. His thick, unyielding arms remained locked securely around her waist and beneath her knees, a rigid iron tether keeping her from slipping down into the black, invisible ravines that yawned just inches from his boots. Abigail pressed her face entirely into the thick, coarse wool fur of his heavy coat. She squeezed her eyes shut, her arms wrapped tightly around the substantial swell of her belly, feeling the frantic, panicked kicks of her unborn child pressing sharply against her lower ribs. Every time Gideon shifted his massive weight to navigate a treacherous, ice-slicked boulder, Abigail expected him to drop her. She was a Thornton. She carried the blood of the men he had spent half a decade slaughtering. She waited for the feral giant to reach the summit, to hurl her into the abyss as payment for his burned cabin and his murdered wife. The drop never came. Just as the last vestiges of feeling entirely left Abigail's fingers, the giant crested a steep, treacherous ridge of black granite and stepped into a sudden, unnatural pocket of stillness. The wind still howled above them, but the immediate battering force of the gale was broken. Abigail forced her eyes open, her eyelashes heavy with crystallized frost. Built directly into the concave, overhanging face of the towering granite cliff was a fortress. The cabin was constructed of massive, unpeeled black pine logs, chinked tightly with hardened clay and crushed river stone. It squatted low to the earth, its heavy sod roof designed to withstand the crushing, violent weight of winter avalanches. There were no welcoming plumes of smoke from the fieldstone chimney, no warm light spilling from the narrow, heavy-shuttered windows. It was a dark, brooding monument to absolute, unyielding isolation. Gideon did not ask if she was well. He stepped up onto the heavy timber porch, kicked the solid oak door open with his iron-shod boot, and carried her into the freezing gloom. The cabin smelled of trapped time, deep wood ash, curing leather, and a profound, suffocating loneliness. Gideon kicked the heavy door shut behind him, sealing out the shrieking wind, and dropped the massive iron bar into its cradle with a terrifying metallic finality. He carried her to the center of the room and set her down on her feet. The moment her ruined, mud-soaked boots touched the uneven, packed earth floorboards, Abigail's frozen legs gave out entirely. The sudden jarring weight of her 6-month pregnancy, combined with the absolute exhaustion of the terror she had endured, pulled her violently downward. She gasped, bracing to hit the dirt floor. Gideon caught her. His grip was shockingly steady, holding her upright by her upper arms until she could balance her awkward, heavy weight against the edge of a massive, scarred wooden table. He looked down at her. In the freezing dark, his face was a shadowed, terrifying landscape. He reached into his pocket, retrieved a lucifer match, and struck it against the tabletop. He lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling joist. The yellow light chased the shadows into the corners, illuminating the stark reality of the beast's den. But it also illuminated his face. The burn scars covering the left side of Gideon's cheek and jaw were violently pink against the cold, a horrific melted map of the fire her father had set. His pale, slate-gray eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. They were cold, dead, and burning with a suppressed, agonizing hatred as he looked at her face, searching for the familial resemblance he so deeply despised. "The bed is yours," Gideon commanded, his voice a flat, gravelly scrape that offered no quarter. He pointed a thick, leather-clad finger toward the far corner, where a large bed frame built from thick birch branches sat piled 2 feet deep, with the incredibly thick, luxurious skins of wolves and buffalo. He walked to the heavy bed, grabbed a single thin wool blanket from beneath the heavy furs, and threw it onto the hard, freezing dirt floor near the drafty front door. "I bought your life with powder and lead tonight, Thornton," Gideon grunted, refusing to use her given name, his massive shoulders tensing under his coat. He wouldn't look at her swollen belly. "But don't mistake this for charity. You stay away from the rifles. You stay out of my way. Why didn't you let me freeze?" Abigail whispered, the words escaping her cracked lips before she could stop them. Her voice trembled, her hands resting protectively over her child. "My father threw me away. I am nothing to him. Keeping me here won't hurt him." Gideon stopped. He slowly turned his head, his scarred profile catching the flickering lantern light. He looked at the floorboards between them, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. "I don't murder children," Gideon rumbled, a lie so heavy with his own unresolved grief it seemed to sink directly into the earth. "And I don't let old men dictate who lives and dies on my mountain." He stood up, grabbing a heavy coil of rope and a felling axe from the log wall. "I have the perimeter to secure and a cord of wood to split before the ice sets," he said, walking toward the door, keeping a wide, deliberate berth around her. "There's dried meat in the cellar. Don't wait up." The heavy oak door slammed shut, the iron latch falling again, leaving Abigail alone in the echoing, freezing silence of the mountain. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her boots. The rejection stung worse than the freezing wind. He had spared her life, yet he treated her like a diseased stray he had taken in out of begrudging obligation, too disgusted by her bloodline to share a space with her, too repulsed to even look her in the eye. "If I do not work, he will despise me more," Abigail thought, the brutal, ingrained lessons of her father's tyrannical household seizing her mind. Josiah Thornton had kicked her out because she could not work the fields. If she sat weeping in the furs, she would be exactly the useless, lazy burden her father had claimed she was. She forced herself to move. Her lower back screamed in violent protest, a deep, radiating ache that settled heavily into her pelvis. She dragged her freezing, mud-soaked skirts across the swept dirt floor. The cabin was built for a beast, not a heavily pregnant woman. The massive fieldstone hearth was choked with 2 feet of cold grey ash. The floor around it was scattered with heavy, unsplit logs of dense hickory. Abigail found a heavy iron ash shovel resting against the stones. She gripped the cold metal handle, her bruised, cracked fingers trembling. She knelt before the hearth, a grueling, agonizing process that required her to carefully widen her stance to accommodate the heavy swell of her belly. The simple act of bending sent a rush of blackness across her vision, but she gritted her teeth, ignoring the shooting pain in her spine, and shoved the heavy iron spade into the compacted ash. She hauled the heavy, freezing soot into a tin bucket, clearing the hearth down to the bare stone. She stacked fresh, dry pine splits and used a handful of dry moss to build the fire from a struggling, smoking flicker into a roaring, heat-producing blaze that finally began to chase the damp cold from the room. In a small root cellar beneath a loose floorboard, she found his larder, shriveled mountain potatoes, dried wild onions, and a half-eaten side of heavily salted venison that had grown hard as wood. She used his heavy butcher knife, throwing her entire upper body weight onto the handle to slice the tough meat, tossing it into a heavy iron pot with water and the vegetables to boil. As the stew began to simmer, filling the stale, lonely air of the cabin with a rich, savory aroma, Abigail saw something thrown carelessly over a barrel in the corner. It was a heavy, thick leather winter gauntlet, lined with rabbit fur. It had been shredded. A massive, jagged tear ripped down the thick hide across the palm, the heavy fabric laid open as if snagged violently on a jagged rock during a climb. Gideon could not wear it, which meant he was out in the approaching blizzard, swinging a felling axe with one hand exposed to the lethal frost. Abigail walked to the barrel. She picked up the heavy glove. It smelled intensely of the man, of pine resin, and of old, dried blood. She searched the shelves near the bed and found a small tin box containing a rusted bone needle and a spool of thick, waxed sinew. She sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair by the roaring fire, dragging the massive gauntlet onto her lap. The intense heat of the flames soaked into her aching back, providing the first real physical comfort she had felt since Caleb had died. She threaded the needle. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but they were not weak. She pushed the thick bone needle through the resistant, tough leather. Her thumb slipped and caught on the sharp end, drawing a bright drop of blood, but she sucked it away, tasted copper, and kept pushing. Over, under, pull tight. Lock the stitch. She worked for hours. The wind outside escalated into a demonic scream, the sound of heavy snow hitting the thick wooden shutters like handfuls of thrown gravel. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs, reacting to the sudden influx of warmth and the smell of the boiling meat. and Abigail rested her hand gently on her belly, humming a quiet, mournful lullaby to soothe the child. The cabin, however, was holding the heat perfectly. The fieldstone radiated a brilliant, life-saving warmth. By the time the heavy oak door finally rattled violently on its iron hinges, Abigail's fingers were cramping, her swollen ankles throbbing with a dull agony, but the massive tear in the leather gauntlet was gone. It was replaced by a neat, incredibly strong line of locking stitches that would hold against any gale. Gideon burst into the room with a violent gust of blinding white snow. He was a snowman built around a core of solid granite. Ice clung to his dark, wild beard and thick icicles. He kicked the door shut, leaning his massive weight against it to drop the heavy iron bar into place, sealing out the lethal cold. He expected the dark. He expected the freezing, empty silence of a cabin that had not felt the touch of a woman in half a decade. He expected a broken, weeping Thornton girl huddled in the corner of his bed, paralyzed by her own fear and the sheer, overwhelming size of the man who had stolen her. He stopped dead, his massive chest heaving. The air was sweltering. The yellow glow of the roaring fire danced across the clean, swept floorboards. The overwhelming, mouth-watering smell of salted venison and wild onions hit him like a physical blow. And there, sitting by the fire, her head resting exhausted against the back of the rocking chair, was Abigail. She had fallen asleep from sheer agonizing exhaustion, the heavy leather gauntlet still resting on the substantial swell of her pregnant belly, her small hand clutching the bone needle. Gideon slowly stripped off his soaked, freezing coat, the wet hide peeling away with a heavy shuck. He walked toward the fire, his heavy boots silent on the dirt floor. He looked at the bubbling pot of stew. He looked at the meticulously stacked firewood. He looked at the gauntlet resting on her child. He saw the stitches. He knew the thickness of that hardened leather. He knew the sheer, mind-numbing effort it would have taken, a heavily pregnant woman, abandoned and freezing only hours before, to haul heavy ash, scrub iron, and push a bone needle through that tough hide for hours. Josiah Thornton would not have lifted a finger to mend a glove if his life depended on it. Her brothers would have demanded a servant do it. Gideon looked at her face. In sleep, the deep lines of constant pain and profound grief were smoothed away. The firelight played across her delicate features, illuminating the dark, bruised circles of exhaustion under her eyes. Gideon didn't look away this time. He stared directly at the woman carrying the bloodline he hated. He didn't see a Thornton. He didn't see a pampered, cruel daughter of a tyrant. He saw a survivor who had bled her own fingers to mend his armor. Abigail shifted in her sleep, letting out a small, quiet sigh of pain, her hand instinctively reaching down to rub the tight, aching muscles of her lower back. Her eyes fluttered open. She gasped, startled to find the giant standing silently over her. She immediately scrambled to sit upright, clutching the gauntlet to her chest, her body tense, waiting for a reprimand for touching his things. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice thick with sleep and lingering fear. "I fell asleep. The stew it's ready. I can fetch you a bowl." Gideon didn't move. He reached down. He didn't touch her. He took hold of the heavy leather gauntlet, pulling it gently from her grip. He held it up to the firelight, inspecting the stitches. They were flawless, stronger than the original seams. He looked back at her. His scarred face was a mask of stoic, hardened stone, but the pale slate of his eyes was cracking, revealing a profound, silent conflict underneath. "You shouldn't be on your feet," he rasped, his voice rougher than the wind howling outside. "I'm not a useless burden, Mr. Locke," Abigail said, her voice shaking, forcing herself to sit tall despite her fear and the burning ache in her spine. "My father threw me in the mud because I was an expense. I will not be an expense to you. I will earn my keep." Gideon stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The violent, bloody friction of his isolated existence was colliding violently with her quiet, undeniable resilience. He walked to the heavy wooden table, dropping the mended glove. "The name is Gideon," he grunted, turning his broad back to her to hide the sudden, unfamiliar tightness in his throat. "Fetch the bowls. We eat while it's hot." Abigail pushed herself up from the rocking chair, her swollen joints popping softly in the quiet cabin, the sudden movement sending a sharp, familiar ache shooting down her lower spine. She moved to the wooden shelves, retrieving 2 battered tin bowls and heavy iron spoons. Her hands were clumsy with lingering cold and exhaustion, but she forced them to remain steady, refusing to let the giant see how close she was to simply collapsing to the floorboards. She laid off the thick, steaming broth and chunks of salted venison into the bowls, setting the larger portion in front of him. They ate in a silence that was heavy, but fundamentally different from the agonizing, terrified quiet of the Thornton farmhouse. That silence had always been built on the precipice of her father's explosive rage. This silence was the cautious, fragile truce of two solitary, wounded creatures sharing a fleeting patch of warmth in an otherwise lethal world. The stew was rich, the salt replacing what the grueling climb had stripped from her body, and the mountain root vegetables melting softly on her tongue. Gideon ate with the focused, methodical intensity of a man stoking an engine, yet he left a substantial portion of the meat in the pot, an unspoken, gruff concession to the child growing inside her. That fragile, quiet warmth was entirely swallowed by the mountain over the next 2 days. The blizzard that descended upon Dead Man's Drop did not merely blow, it shrieked like a wounded animal, a continuous deafening roar that battered the thick black pine logs of the cabin. The temperature plummeted so violently that the moisture from their breath crystallized in the air the moment they stepped away from the fieldstone hearth. They existed in a twilight world of roaring fire, heavy shadows, and absolute claustrophobic isolation. 10 feet of hard-packed drift snow sealed the heavy oak door completely shut. Gideon spoke very little, but Abigail watched him closely. He moved through the small space with a deliberate, heavy grace, constantly bringing in wood from the attached lean-to, ensuring the fire never died. But by the afternoon of the 3rd day, the fluid, lethal grace of the assassin began to severely falter. He was sweating. Despite the freezing draft leaking through the heavy shutters, thick beads of perspiration clung to his scarred forehead. His breathing had grown shallow and raspy, carrying a wet, rattling wheeze deep in his massive chest. "Mr. Locke," Abigail ventured softly from the rocking chair, her hands resting protectively over her belly. "You are unwell. You need to sit." "I am fine," Gideon grunted, his voice a tight, strangled gravel. He reached for a heavy log to throw onto the fire. The moment his massive fingers closed around the rough bark, his knees simply ceased to function. He didn't stumble, he collapsed like a felled timber. He crashed heavily onto the packed earth floorboards, the heavy hickory log clattering uselessly against the stone hearth. A violent, full-body tremor seized his massive frame, his teeth chattering so hard the sound echoed in the small room. "Gideon!" Abigail cried out, the terror instantly returning, but not for herself. She forced her heavily pregnant body out of the chair, dropping clumsily to her knees beside him on the dirt floor. His skin was radiating a lethal, unnatural heat, burning straight through the thick canvas of his shirt. He groaned, his pale slate eyes rolling back slightly in his head, entirely consumed by a sudden, violent septic fever. Abigail didn't hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his heavy canvas shirt and yanked hard, tearing the wooden buttons free. Beneath the fabric, high on his left shoulder, was a horrific, swollen mass of angry, inflamed flesh. It was an old bullet, wound a deep, jagged hole that had healed cleanly over the top, but had festered deep within the muscle. The sheer, brutal, physical exertion of carrying her and her unborn child up the vertical face of the mountain in a blizzard had torn the fragile internal scar tissue wide open. The trapped infection had flooded directly into his bloodstream. Abigail recognized the distinct, puckered entry wound. It was from a heavy-caliber Winchester, the exact rifle her brother Caleb carried. The Thorntons had put the lead in him, and her rescue had finally broken the wound open. "I have to clean this," Abigail panted, her own breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as the baby kicked violently in protest to her cramped position. "Gideon, I have to open it." He didn't answer. He was shivering uncontrollably, his mind slipping rapidly into the dark, agonizing corridors of delirium. Abigail dragged herself to the hearth. She swung a heavy iron kettle of snowmelt over the hottest part of the flames. From his supply sacks in the root cellar, she frantically dug out bundles of dried herbs, recognizing the sharp, bitter scent of willow bark for the fever and dried yarrow for the infection. When the water reached a rolling, furious boil, she steeped the willow bark into a dark, pungent tea. She dragged his heavy upper body up, resting his head against her thigh, and forced his locked jaw open, trickling the bitter liquid down his throat until he swallowed instinctively. Then she took his heavy skinning knife. She sterilized the blade in the roaring fire until the steel glowed a dull orange. "Forgive me," Abigail whispered, tears of empathetic pain streaming down her face. She pressed the flat of the hot blade against the swollen, infected mass on his shoulder. Gideon roared in his delirium, a guttural, agonizing sound, his massive body thrashing against the floorboards. But Abigail threw her upper body over his chest, using the substantial weight of her pregnancy to pin him down with sheer, desperate determination. The wound burst open, weeping, putrid, dark blood. She used a clean rag and boiling water to aggressively scrub the infection from the torn muscle, packing the deep hole with a thick poultice of crushed yarrow, and bound his shoulder tightly with strips torn from her own petticoat. But the septic fever had already set deep into his blood. He began to shake with a violent, terrifying rigor, freezing to death from the inside out despite the blazing fire. Survival in the high mountains demanded life. Abigail stood up. Her fingers, stiff and stained with his blood, unbuttoned her coarse, mud-stained dress. It pooled at her feet. She stripped down to her thin, threadbare cotton camise, exposing the heavy, pronounced swell of her 6-month pregnancy. She dragged the heaviest buffalo robes from the bed, piling them over his massive frame on the floor. Then she lifted the edge of the heavy furs and crawled underneath them, pressing her soft, fragile, swollen body directly against Gideon's massive, freezing, shivering form. The shock of his icy skin against hers made her gasp, a full-body shudder racking her frame. She maneuvered carefully, protecting her belly, but forced herself to wrap her arms tightly around his broad chest. She pressed her beating heart against his rigid ribcage, burying her face into the crook of his uninjured neck. "Take the warmth," she whispered fiercely into his icy skin, willing the life of 2 beating hearts into his failing one. "You saved my child. Do not die in the dark. Please do not die." For an hour, he shivered violently, his body convulsing against hers. Abigail held on tight, a warm, unyielding anchor in the freezing blackness. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering began to subside. His breathing deepened, the shallow, erratic gasps smoothing into a heavy, rhythmic rumble. Then the fever fully took his mind. As his massive body fought off the infection, he thrashed weakly beneath the furs, his mind slipping back into the ashes of the night that had turned him into a monster. "Mary," Gideon mumbled, his voice a broken, raspy scrape that tore at Abigail's heart. "Mary, the door is barred from the outside. The smoke." Abigail held him tighter, her hand stroking his sweat-dampened dark hair. "Hush. Hush now. The fire is in the hearth. You're safe." He didn't hear her. His large, calloused hand came up, grasping blindly in the dark beneath the furs until his thick fingers locked onto the fabric of her camise. "I couldn't break the window," Gideon wept, a single hot tear tracking down his heavily scarred, melted cheek. It was a sound of absolute, devastating heartbreak that shattered the image of the invincible wraith entirely. "Josiah," he poured the pitch. "He wanted the valley acreage. I told him you were inside. I told him you were heavy with child. He just lit the match. God, Mary, he burned you alive." Abigail froze, the breath leaving her lungs in a quiet, devastated rush. The room spun. The feral isolation, the systematic assassination of her uncles and cousins, the terrifying reputation, it wasn't madness. It was absolute, righteous retribution. Her father, Josiah Thornton, had not just stolen land. He had barred the doors of Gideon's cabin and burned Gideon's pregnant wife to death simply to expand his property lines. The burn scars covering the giant's face were from a desperate, failed attempt to drag his family from an inferno set by her own blood. "I am the daughter of a monster," Abigail thought, hot tears spilling down her cheeks, falling onto his fever-hot chest. She didn't pull away in horror. The realization only deepened her profound, shattering empathy for the broken man holding her. She pressed her face against his scarred jaw, holding the ruined side of him with a fierce, protective tenderness. "I am so sorry, Gideon," she wept into the dark. "I am so sorry." His thrashing ceased. The frantic, rolling motion of his eyes beneath his closed eyelids slowed. The heavy, suffocating grip of his guilt seemed to loosen just a fraction at the feel of her tears on his skin. He sank into a deep, healing, dreamless sleep. By the time the grey, watery light of dawn filtered through the frosted window slits, the storm had finally broken into a quiet, spent sigh against the logs. Gideon opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the furs, the dull, deep, throbbing ache in his bandaged shoulder, and the astonishing, overwhelming heat pressed along the entire length of his body. He turned his head slowly. Abigail was asleep, her face inches from his own. Her dark hair was splayed across his massive arm. Her thin arm was thrown over his torso, her soft body pressed intimately against his hardened muscle. But it was the positioning of her body that stole the breath entirely from his lungs. In her sleep, she had shifted. The heavy, pronounced swell of her pregnant belly was pressed firmly against the side of his waist beneath the thick buffalo robes. Gideon did not move. He barely breathed. He remembered the blinding agony of the torn muscle, the freezing blackness, the absolute certainty that the Thornton bullet had finally claimed him. And he remembered the searing heat of the blade, the sharp bite of willow bark, and the soft, fierce voice commanding him to live. A Thornton had kept him breathing. A Thornton had stripped herself bare to cure his freezing blood. As he watched her sleep in the pale morning light, something miraculous happened beneath the heavy furs. Against the rigid, scarred muscle of Gideon's waist, there was a sudden, sharp, distinct thump. Gideon's eyes widened. He froze. A second later, it happened again, a strong rolling kick from the unborn child resting within Abigail's womb, pressing directly against his skin. Gideon's hand trembled. Slowly, with an agonizing, religious reverence, he moved his massive, calloused right hand beneath the heavy blankets. He didn't pull away from the daughter of his enemy. He gently, tentatively rested his broad, scarred palm fully over the warm, tight swell of her belly. He waited. Thump. A tiny heel pressed upward, right into the center of his palm. A ragged, choking gasp escaped Gideon's lips. The heavy iron walls of hatred and vengeance he had built around his soul for 5 long, bloody years, instantly shattered into fine, unrecognizable dust. He wasn't touching the spawn of Josiah Thornton. He was touching a pure, untainted, innocent life. He was touching the very miracle he had been robbed of in the fire. Abigail shifted, letting out a small sigh, her eyes slowly fluttering open. She gasped softly, immediately realizing how intimately she was pressed against him, and moved to pull away, her face flushing with sudden apprehension. "Don't," Gideon whispered, his voice incredibly deep, rough, and entirely devoid of the cold, dead slate that had defined him. He didn't let her move away. He kept his massive hand resting gently, protectively over her child. He looked up, meeting her terrified, exhausted eyes. The wraith of dead man's drop was gone. The pale slate of his eyes was warm, swimming with a profound, earth-shattering awe. "He's strong," Gideon rumbled, his thumb brushing lightly over the carton of her camise as the baby shifted again. He moved his gaze from her belly up to her face, looking at the dark circles, the bruised hands that had fought death for him. "You gave me your warmth. You saved my life, Abigail." It was the first time he had used her name. It wasn't a curse, it was a vow. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The warmth of that single, impossible vow settled deep into the marrow of Abigail's bones, thawing a lifetime of frozen terror. As the brutal high country winter slowly exhausted its fury over the next 3 months, the grip of the ice upon Dead Man's Drop began to painfully loosen. The spring thaw did not arrive with a gentle, whispering breeze. It announced itself with the violent, concussive cracking of deep ice giving way. Rushing cataracts of black meltwater and viscous slush tore through the jagged ravines, carrying boulders the size of anvils in their frothing, icy jaws. Inside the heavy black pine cabin, the oppressive, terrifying isolation had transformed into a fierce, quiet sanctuary. Gideon's infected shoulder had healed into a thick, knotted ridge of pink scar tissue. He moved with the lethal, predatory grace of the mountain once more, but his fierce, pale eyes tracked Abigail with a constant, hovering devotion. She was now 9 months pregnant, her belly a massive, heavy, magnificent burden that altered her center of gravity and made her spine ache with a dull, constant throb. Gideon had spent the thawing weeks carving a beautiful, smooth-sanded cradle from soft cedar, placing it directly beside the warmth of the roaring fieldstone hearth. It was a Tuesday morning, the air thick with the smell of turning earth, wet pine needles, and the sharp scent of brewing chicory coffee. Crack. The sound was utterly foreign to the high peaks. It was sharp, flat, and metallic. Before Abigail could even turn her head from the cast-iron stove, a heavy lead slug shattered the thick wooden shutter of the front window, tearing through the cabin in a shower of jagged, lethal splinters. The bullet slammed directly into the heavy clay pitcher resting on the oak table, exploding the vessel into 1,000 razor-sharp shards. Gideon moved before the deafening echo of the gunshot had even faded from the granite cliffs. The heavy skinning knife he had been sharpening dropped to the floorboards. He lunged across the sweeping dirt floor, his massive frame moving with a terrifying, explosive speed, tackling Abigail to the floorboards, just as a second bullet tore through the roof timbers above them. "Stay down!" Gideon roared, his voice completely devoid of the gentle, rumbling warmth it had held for months. The wraith of Dead Man's Drop had returned in an instant, his slate-grey eyes wild, feral, and blazing with a holy, terrifying wrath. He covered her massive, pregnant belly with his own broad back, shielding her entirely. Outside, the slushy mud of the yard was being violently churned by the heavy boots of men. "Lock!" The voice that floated over the rushing mountain wind made Abigail's stomach violently heave, the taste of chicory turning to pure bile in her mouth. It was Josiah Thornton. It was the voice of the freezing mud, of the whip, of the cruel, calculated tyranny that had nearly murdered her and her unborn child. "Come out, you scarred beast!" Josiah screamed, his voice thick with an ugly, desperate greed, amplified by the safety of the tree line. "The snow is melted. We brought the county bounty posters, $1,000 in gold for the wraith, dead or alive. We've come to collect, and we've come for the traitor whore you stole." Gideon rolled off Abigail, keeping low to the floorboards. He scrambled to the center of the room, his thick fingers finding the recessed iron ring of the root cellar trapdoor. He yanked it upward, exposing the dark earthen hole. "Get in the dark," Gideon commanded, his jaw clenched so tight the pink burn scars pulled taut across his bone. He shoved a heavy, loaded Colt revolver into her hands. "Hide the child. If the face looking down ain't mine, you empty the cylinder into it. Do you understand? Gideon, they have repeating rifles." Abigail choked out, the suffocating, ingrained terror of her father threatening to paralyze her throat. "They'll kill you." "They brought paper cartridges and loud mouths," Gideon rumbled, turning his back to the door and pulling his massive Sharps buffalo rifle from the wall. He reached over his other shoulder, drawing his heavy-headed iron felling axe. "I am the mountain." He didn't wait for her to descend. He kicked the heavy oak front door entirely open with his iron-shod boot and stepped out onto the porch, a towering, nightmarish silhouette against the bright morning glare. "Fire! Bring the savage down!" Josiah yelled in panic. A ragged volley of rifle fire erupted from the trees. Bullets hammered the thick black pine logs of the cabin, tearing massive, deadly splinters from the wood. Gideon didn't retreat inside for cover. He vaulted over the heavy timber railing, landing in the freezing ankle-deep slush of the yard with a heavy wet splash. He didn't fire the Sharps. It took too long to reload. Instead, he led the two eldest Thornton brothers directly into the treacherous, slush-covered killing field he had spent 5 years preparing. The brothers rushed from the tree line, their boots churning the mud, their Winchesters raised to fire. The eldest brother took 3 steps toward the porch. Snap! The sound was a deafening, metallic crunch that echoed off the cliffs. Hidden beneath a deep puddle of muddy meltwater was a massive, steel-jawed bear trap Gideon had buried the night before. The jagged, rusted iron teeth slammed shut with bone-crushing force directly on the eldest brother's calf. The tibia and fibula bones shattered instantly. The brother didn't just scream, he shrieked a high, inhuman, piercing wail of absolute, paralyzing agony, collapsing into the bloody slush. The second brother froze in absolute horror, looking down at his trapped sibling. It was a fatal hesitation. Gideon moved through the mud with a terrifying, unnatural speed. He met the second brother before the man could turn his rifle. Gideon swung the heavy felling axe in a brutal horizontal arc. The flat iron back of the axe head crushed the man's ribs with a sickening crunch, sending him crashing into the mud beside his brother. The yard became a chaotic, swirling nightmare of acrid sulfur, copper blood, and raw, visceral violence. Gideon was a force of nature, a feral demon taking his long-awaited vengeance. But in his feral, blood-soaked rage, the giant had been drawn down the slope, away from the cabin walls. Josiah Thornton had not joined the charge in the mud. He was a coward who fought only women and the weak. While Gideon decimated his sons, Josiah slicked around the jagged granite cliff face, moving toward the back of the cabin where a narrow window had been shattered by the crossfire. Inside the cabin, Abigail had not gone down into the root cellar. Her 9-month belly was simply too massive, the awkward weight preventing her from climbing down the steep wooden ladder quickly enough. She heard the deafening cracks of gunfire outside, the metallic scent of black powder drifting through the open front door. Then she heard the loud, unmistakable crunch of heavy boots on broken glass. Not outside. Inside. Abigail froze. She crouched behind the heavy oak table, the Colt revolver heavy and shaking violently in her hands. A man smelling of stale tobacco, expensive broadcloth and unwashed sweat was climbing through the shattered rear window. Josiah dropped heavily onto the dirt floor, his breathing ragged, his heavy, silver-plated revolver gripped tightly in his meaty hand. His small, cruel eyes darted wildly around the dim space, searching for his daughter. He turned toward the hearth, and he stopped dead. Standing beside the cast-iron stove, her hands gripping the heavy wooden table, was Abigail. She wasn't the shivering, fainting girl weeping in the freezing mud. She was wearing Gideon's oversized flannel shirt, her massive, pregnant belly prominent and fiercely guarded. Well, well, Josiah breathed, profound shock warring with his malicious disgust. An ugly, vicious sneer twisted his thin lips. Look at the traitor whore, keeping house for the savage who just butchered your brothers. You're a disgrace to the Thornton name. He took a step toward her, raising the heavy revolver, cocking the hammer back with a sharp, metallic click. I'm going to put a bullet in that bastard child, Josiah spat, his eyes narrowing into cruel slits, and then I'm going to shoot you for trespassing on my honor. Abigail didn't cower. She didn't weep. She looked at the man who had starved her, who had kicked her into a blizzard, who had murdered Gideon's first wife in a fire out of pure, unadulterated greed. The suffocating, ingrained terror of her childhood vanished entirely, replaced by a blinding, white-hot inferno of maternal rage. She was no longer a victim. She was a mother. She was the Wraith's wife. Abigail didn't raise the heavy Colt revolver. Her hands were shaking too badly with adrenaline to steady the heavy weapon accurately. Instead, she dropped the gun to the dirt. Her right hand swept down to the top of the stove. Resting directly over the hottest flames was a massive, cast-iron kettle filled to the brim with boiling water she had been using for the chicory coffee. The water was at a furious, rolling boil, hissing and spitting steam into the air. Her fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy iron handle. It was blisteringly hot, searing her palm, but she didn't let go. Josiah lunged forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. She swung. Abigail brought the massive iron kettle out from her side in a brutal, desperate, two-handed arc. She put every ounce of her heavily pregnant upper body strength and the full, substantial momentum of her turning hips into the throw. The heavy kettle left her hands. A massive, scalding wave of violently boiling water flew through the air in a perfect, arching sheet of lethal heat. The boiling water hit Josiah Thornton directly in the face and chest. The sound of his flesh blistering instantly was drowned out by his scream. It was not a shout. It was the shrill, bubbling shriek of a man being boiled alive in his own clothes. The heavy revolver fired wildly into the ceiling, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the heavy roof sod. Josiah dropped the gun, his hands flying to his ruined, scalding face, the expensive broadcloth suit instantly fusing to the blistering skin of his chest. He crashed heavily to his knees on the dirt floor, thrashing and weeping in absolute, blinding agony. Abigail stood over him, her massive chest heaving, the breath hissing aggressively through her teeth. A burned palm throbbed, but she didn't care. She looked down at the tyrant who had terrorized her entire life, watching him writhe in the dirt. The heavy front door was suddenly filled with a massive, looming shadow. Gideon burst back into the room. He was a terrifying vision of absolute carnage. His chest was heaving, his canvas shirt soaked in the blood of the Thornton sons outside. The heavy felling axe in his hand dripped thick crimson onto the pristine floorboards. His pale slate-grey eyes were wild with panic, expecting to find her bleeding on the floor. He looked at the shattered rear window. He looked at the screaming, blistering, broken patriarch writhing in the dirt. And he looked at Abigail. She stood tall, her pregnant belly proudly thrust forward, her beautiful face flushed with exertion, her eyes blazing with a fierce, untamed fire. She met his shocked gaze, her breathing ragged but entirely steady. Gideon didn't speak. He stepped forward, his heavy boots silent on the dirt. He loomed over the screaming, blinded form of Josiah Thornton, raising the heavy iron felling axe high into the air, ready to bring the final brutal stroke of vengeance down upon the man who had burned his past. The heavy iron axe head hung suspended in the freezing, gun-smoke-choked air for a single, agonizing heartbeat. Gideon's massive, heavily scarred muscles coiled, locked and trembling with the sheer explosive force required to cleave the tyrant in two. But as his pale slate-grey eyes flicked upward from the screaming man in the dirt, they caught the fierce protective stance of Abigail. She stood in the center of the destruction, her hands instinctively cradling the massive, heavy swell of her 9-month pregnancy, her chest heaving with the absolute refusal to be a victim. The blinding, feral bloodlust that had consumed Gideon's soul for 5 brutal years suddenly shattered against the profound, undeniable reality of the life she carried. He would not christen the floorboards of his child's sanctuary with the butchered gore of her father. Gideon's jaw clamped shut. With a guttural roar of sheer, redirected physical exertion, he deliberately altered the trajectory of the massive weapon. The heavy iron blade missed Josiah's thrashing head by a fraction of an inch, biting so deeply into the packed earth floorboards and the thick pine joist beneath that the wooden handle vibrated violently with the impact. Gideon didn't pull it free. He reached down with his massive, calloused hands, grabbing the screaming, blistering patriarch by the collar of his ruined, steaming broadcloth coat. He hauled Josiah Thornton entirely off the ground, dragging him backward across the dirt, out the shattered front door, and across the blood-soaked, freezing slush of the yard. When he reached the sheer, jagged edge of Dead Man's Drop, the wraith of the mountain did not hesitate. He hurled the blindingly agonizing tyrant into the howling, bottomless void, letting the jagged granite and the freezing meltwater hundreds of feet below claim the final architect of his suffering. The agonizing screams faded into the rushing roar of the wind. The Thornton farm was eradicated. The debt was paid in full. Gideon stood on the edge of the precipice, his massive chest heaving, the icy mountain air burning his lungs. The terrifying feral adrenaline that had carried him through the slaughter instantly evaporated, leaving a crushing, hollow exhaustion in its wake. He turned slowly, his heavy iron-shod boots dragging across the slush as he stepped back over the threshold into the sweltering, smoke-filled heat of the cabin. Abigail stood by the heavy oak table. The sheer terror and maternal rage that had fueled her were draining away, leaving her legs trembling so violently she had to lean heavily against the thick wood to remain upright. The heavy iron kettle lay on its side near the hearth, the spilled water turning the dirt floor into thick, warm mud. Gideon crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't speak. He reached out and gently took her right hand. The palm was a violent, angry red, the delicate skin already beginning to blister fiercely from gripping the scalding cast-iron handle of the kettle. Gideon's pale eyes darkened with a profound, agonizing guilt. He guided her to the rocking chair, easing her heavy, exhausted, pregnant frame into the seat with breathtaking, reverent care. He moved to the root cellar, fetching a wooden bucket of clean, packed snow and a small tin of thick, waxy yarrow salve. He knelt on the dirt floor before her, his massive frame dwarfing the chair. His hands were stained with black powder and the copper-scented blood of her brothers, but his touch was incredibly, shockingly light. He packed the freezing snow gently against her blistering palm, drawing the searing heat from the burn. "I brought this to your door," Gideon whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely carried over the crackle of the hearth. He kept his eyes focused entirely on her burned hand, unable to look at her face. "I dragged you up this mountain and I brought a slaughterhouse directly to your feet." You kept us alive, Abigail breathed, her uninjured hand resting heavily on the substantial curve of her belly. You ended the monster who threw us into the ice. Gideon shook his head, the dark, wildly tangled hair falling over his heavily scarred, melted cheek. He finished wrapping her hand in a clean strip of white linen. He stood up, but he didn't stay by her side. He walked to the corner of the cabin, prying up a loose floorboard beneath the heavy birch bed. He reached deep into the dark cavity and pulled out a heavy, worn canvas satchel. He carried it to the table and dropped it. It hit the thick oak with a dense, incredibly heavy thud that rattled the tin plates. He untied the thick leather drawstrings. Inside, gleaming dully in the pale morning light filtering through the gun smoke, were dozens of heavy, pure gold double eagles and tightly rolled stacks of banknotes. It was a king's ransom. The bounties of outlaws he had tracked, the price of rare pelts, the hoarded wealth of a man who had never planned on having a future to spend it on. Gideon pushed the heavy bag toward Abigail. "The pass is clear," Gideon rumbled, his voice turning flat, brittle, and completely devoid of the quiet, rumbling warmth they had shared over the last 3 months. He forced himself to stare blankly at the scarred wood of the table. "I can hitch the draft horse to the sled. You won't have to walk. You can ride straight to the railhead in Fort Smith, take the train east, to St. Louis, or Boston, before the child comes." Abigail's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She gripped the wooden armrests of the rocking chair. "Gideon, what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're wealthy," he growled, his broad shoulders shaking violently with the sheer monumental effort it took to maintain the lie of his indifference. "There's enough gold in that bag to buy a grand house, to hire doctors, to buy soft clothes and warm beds for the baby. You can hire guards. You can be safe." "I am safe here," Abigail pleaded, her voice cracking, hot tears welling in her exhausted eyes, threatening to spill over her pale cheeks. "Look around!" Gideon roared, the sudden, booming volume making her flinch backward. He struck his own massive, blood-stained chest with his fist. "Does this look safe? I'm a feral man, Abigail. I live a brutal, dark life in the dirt and the blood. The town is right. Your father was right to fear me. I am a scarred, broken beast. I am covered in the blood of your family. I can't protect you from the world when I'm the very monster the world comes hunting to destroy." He looked at her then, his pale, slate-grey eye swimming with a grief so profound, so devastatingly deep, it seemed to hollow out his massive chest entirely. "You are too good for this dark," he whispered, his voice breaking, a single tear cutting a clean line through the soot and dirt on his scarred face. "That child deserves a father who isn't a ghost. Take the gold. Go live in the light." Abigail stared at the heavy canvas satchel. It was the answer to every desperate weeping prayer of her childhood, the absolute key to a life of unimaginable ease where she would never have to fear the cold or hunger or the cruel hands of men ever again. She looked at the heavy bag. She pushed herself up from the rocking chair, her back aching, her massive belly shifting heavily. She walked to the table. She didn't pick up the bag. She raised her uninjured left hand and shoved the heavy canvas satchel completely off the edge. The bag hit the dirt floor, spilling a cascade of glittering gold coins across the packed earth. Gideon's eyes flew wide open. His jaw dropped, the breath rushing from his massive lungs in a stunned, disbelieving exhale. "Woman, are you mad? That was your freedom!" Abigail turned to face him. The bright, morning light framed her fiercely pregnant silhouette, the freezing mountain wind whipping through the shattered window behind her. She didn't look like a ruined, weeping widow. She looked like an absolute queen standing in the exact center of her own impenetrable fortress. "Freedom from what?" she demanded, closing the distance between them with steady, purposeful strides despite her heavy burden. "From you? From the only man who ever looked at my child and didn't see a burden to be starved, but a life to be protected? From the man who took a bullet wound and a fever just to carry me out of the snow?" She walked right up to him, invading his space, forcing the towering giant to look down into her fierce, tear-filled eyes. "You think a bag of metal makes me safe?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling with an overwhelming, consuming love that dwarfed the fear of any bullet. "I lived in a civilized house, Gideon, and they threw me in the mud to freeze to death because I ate too much. I don't want a civilized life. I don't want a civilized man. She reached out, grabbing the thick canvas of his open, blood-stained shirt, and yanked downward with every ounce of her remaining strength. He stumbled, his knees giving way under the sheer, unexpected force of her conviction. He fell heavily to his knees on the pine floorboards, his massive, heavily scarred face coming level with the substantial, magnificent swell of her belly. "My family died the night they threw me in the snow," Abigail whispered fiercely, her soft, warm hands coming up to gently cradle his massive, bearded, scarred face. She didn't flinch from the blood or the jagged, melted burns. She pressed her palms directly against his cheeks, pulling his head forward until his forehead rested gently against her pregnant stomach. "You are the only father this child will ever know. We are not going anywhere, my giant. We are staying." Gideon broke. The heavy iron walls he had built around his soul for 5 agonizing years, the punishing isolation he had sentenced himself to in the frozen peaks, shattered into fine, unrecognizable dust. A ragged, choking sob ripped out of his massive chest, a sound of such profound, agonizing release it physically shook the floorboards beneath them. He wrapped his thick, powerful arms entirely around her waist, burying his scarred face deeper into the soft, warm curve of her belly, holding onto her with a desperate, holy reverence. "My Abigail," he wept, the hot tears soaking into the fabric of her flannel shirt, washing away the cold and the blood. "My wife, my heart." "I am right here," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his thick, dark, wildly tangled hair, feeling the violent trembling of his broad shoulders slowly begin to ease against her body. "The ghosts are gone. The mountain belongs to us now." Beneath the fabric of her shirt, directly against the scarred, wet skin of Gideon's cheek, the baby delivered a strong, rolling kick. Gideon let out a wet, broken laugh, turning his head to press a soft, lingering kiss directly against the swell of her stomach, kissing the life he had sworn to protect, worshipping the very flesh that had brought him back from the dead. He held her there in the ruins of the fight, the cold wind blowing through the shattered glass, the fire popping warmly in the cast-iron stove. The gold lay scattered and forgotten in the dirt. But as Gideon Locke held the woman who had chosen his scarred darkness over the world's light, he knew with absolute undeniable certainty that he had never been richer. Epilogue. 1 year later, the summer sun in Dead Man's Drop was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the rugged, jagged granite into a warm, vibrant canopy of emerald pine and blooming mountain laurel. The cabin had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a dark, brooding cave built for a solitary assassin to hide from his ghosts. The logs had been meticulously re-chinked with bright, clean clay. A wide wraparound porch of smooth, sanded cedar had been added, facing the valley below, catching the warm southern drafts. The shattered back window was now a beautiful pane of clear glass that let the morning light flood the swept wooden floors. The heavy scent of isolation was entirely gone, replaced by the constant, sweet aroma of baking bread, drying lavender, and fresh pine shavings. On the porch, sitting in a heavy, wide-backed rocking chair, was Gideon. He wore a clean canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his thick, heavily muscled forearms. The cold, dead slate of his eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep peace. The jagged, burned scars on his face were still there, but they no longer looked like a map of pure hatred. They were simply the weathered lines of a man who had survived the fire. Resting effortlessly against his massive, broad chest, supported entirely by his large, gentle hands, was a plump, giggling infant boy with a mop of thick, dark hair and bright, slate-gray eyes. The heavy oak door creaked open. Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She wore a dress of soft, light blue cotton, the collar open and loose. She moved with total, unshakable confidence, a profound, radiant health glowing from her skin, her dark hair pinned loosely up, catching the golden sunlight. She walked up behind the rocking chair, resting her arms over Gideon's broad shoulders, leaning her cheek against the crown of his dark head. She looked down at the baby who was currently trying with absolute focused determination to fit his father's thick thumb entirely into his mouth. "He's got your stubbornness, Gideon." Abigail smiled, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her husband's scarred cheek. Gideon chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated in the warm air, echoing off the pines. "He's a Locke, He knows how to hold his ground. Gideon turned his head, capturing her lips in a soft, lingering kiss, tasting the morning chicory and the crisp mountain air. He didn't just kiss her. He held her entirely, leaning back into her embrace, surrounded by the family he had thought he would never have again. They stayed together on the porch, looking out over the jagged, beautiful wilderness that had once been a prison of grief and vengeance. Far below, where the valley opened up, the mud and cruelty of the Thornton farm were a lifetime away, utterly forgotten. Up on the ridge, bathed in the light of the afternoon sun, the giant and his queen held everything that mattered, completely safe, wildly loved, and entirely, perfectly free.